Welcome everyone. My name is Vlasta Sikimić, and I will talk about the interplay between political and epistemic views of scientists. Let's start on a lighter note with a joke. Study finds that hearing an opposing viewpoint causes no real harm. On the contrary, listening to opposing viewpoints can be epistemically beneficial, can help us gather knowledge, and can, in the context of virtue epistemology, can be considered as an epistemic virtue. What is epistemic tolerance in the scientific context? Epistemic tolerance occurs in situations in which two researchers disagree with each other. They have conflicting hypotheses. However, they are still open that the opposing viewpoint might be right or might have value for the scientific community. As the corresponding epistemic vice to epistemic tolerance, we will talk about epistemicauthoritarianism, which is an attitude of accepting current epistemic authorities within a research field without questioning them. Also, we will be interested in questioning of the scientific method, or in other words, in the skepticism about the scientific method. These three notions will be the epistemic attitudes that we will examine, and we will also examine beliefs in science and pseudoscience. In particular, we will talk about beliefs in astrology and not believing in the theory of evolution. All of this with the goal of investigating the impact of sociopolitical views on scientific beliefs, which later translate in the scientific decisions. The research that I'm presenting to you today was published in 2020 in the Review of Philosophy and Psychology, together with my co-authors. If you're interested in this research, you can read the article in more details. The philosophical motivation behind studying this notion is, of course, the huge value-free debate of science. So the questions, should science be free of political values? Just think of Max Weber's claim that scientists should not be influenced by their social political views when they do research. On the other hand, in the contemporary research in philosophy of science, there are certain statements that ethical considerations are very important for responsible scientific research. Still, we can all agree that we don't necessarily want that epistemic decisions that scientists are making are dependent on their socio-political views. Also, we do notice that classical philosophy of science is impacted by political views. For instance, Feyerabend's philosophy definitely had influence from his liberal political views, and something similar could be stated for Popper. From the perspective of social psychology, we do know that conservatism is related to beliefs about science. In other words, that conservativists tend, for instance, in our case, to question the theory of evolution more. Thus, we wanted to put all these assumptions to test all these assumptions, and we use an empirical approach for that. We were interested in how scientists really reason, and we believe that suggesting corrective measures and normative normative conclusions only come afterwards, once we established what is really the case in reality. So what do scientists care about and how do they actually reason? In this context, we see armchair burning that symbolizes the switch in philosophy from Descartes' armchair approach, where philosophers are only doing thought experiments. And now we are moving and do some experimental or empirical philosophy. So we are moving in the real world and we are gathering the data about researchers. The scheme of the project is as follows. On the one hand, we had beliefs about science, so beliefs in the theory of evolution and astrological beliefs. Here, of course, we wanted and hoped that researchers will believe in evolution and not believe in astrology. Then the central concern of our paper was investigating epistemic attitudes of researchers, in particular, epistemic authoritarianism, epistemic tolerance, and skepticism towards the scientific method. Finally, we wanted to see whether there are some correlations and effects in interplay between these epistemic stances and sociopolitical attitudes, which we tested in two ways: by measuring the degree of conservatism of researchers and their political orientation. Please note that though conservatism and political orientation can be considered as similar, the correspondence between them is not one-to-one. So even though someone might be right-winged, doesn't necessarily mean that this person will be conservative in every aspect, might have some liberal views, for instance, when it comes to economy and so on. The same holds for the left political orientation. It's possible that somebody who would rank herself left on the political spectrum would have some conservative values concerning social-political values. On the other hand, we should also remember famous Kuhn's theories. When we were making assumptions for this paper, we were thinking about the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values in science, but we were also thinking about Kuhn's distinction between paradigmatic and pre-paradigmatic sciences. Pre-paradigmatic sciences are social sciences, actually the ones in which we don't have yet an established dominant method that will tell us how to proceed. So there are different competing theories existing together. While natural sciences can be considered as paradigmatic, so there is one dominant paradigm, there might be paradigm shifts, but there is one uniform way how research is done. In that context, we wondered whether researchers from natural sciences might be less epistemically authoritarian and more epistemically tolerant, because their discipline is in this pre-paradigmatic state, as Kuhn would put it. We also thought about Kuhn's argument that young researchers learn from standard textbooks, so they learn the methods from dominating paradigms, and later in life they sometimes do normal science, but sometimes they also have to do something radically different. And in this context, epistemic diversity is important, so different approaches, trying something new, which would then also make them more epistemically tolerant, right? Or we have maybe an opposing effect, that we have researchers that are not modeled in any specific way, and then they learn from standard textbooks and become less tolerant, more authoritarian, right? So kind of following one main paradigm. So our hypothesis was that there might be an effect of career stage on the tested epistemic attitudes, and there also might be an effect of the career stage on beliefs about science. So that could be something positive. For instance, that while doing science, you're learning more that scientific method is correct, and the theory of evolution is a scientific theory, that astrology is not, etc. We assumed that conservativists will score lower on the epistemic tolerance scale and higher on the epistemic authoritarianism. We also wondered whether there will be an effect of political orientation and skepticism towards the scientific method. That could go in two directions. You could also expect that someone who is left on the political spectrum would tend to question scientific method and think, okay, we shouldn't be so rigid in our thinking. right? And we wondered whether there will be an impact of the scientific field, so natural versus social sciences, when it comes to different epistemic attitudes. The contribution of our research are the following. We operationalized the notions of epistemic tolerance, authoritarianism, and skepticism towards the scientific method. What does this mean? This means that we proposed scales for measuring these attitudes, and these scales are statistically satisfactory, which means that they are reliable and can be used in future studies. I'm very proud of our sample. Our sample was large. We had 655 participants, all scientists, coming from different disciplines, and this was not easy to achieve. So we really put quite some work to motivate researchers to fill in our survey, and they found the survey rather interesting. We gathered findings about interplay between sociopolitical and epistemic attitudes, which is something actually rather promising because we did not find strong effects between these two, which can tell us that science might actually be value-free, or I mean, free of political values. We were also interested in this distinction, these distinctions that I mentioned, so between junior and senior researchers, natural and social sciences, and we found some data about that. To give you an illustration of how the instruments that we created looked, they were Likert type scales. This means that there were certain items which researchers were supposed to rank from strongly agree to from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So this is a 5-point Likert type scale. Number 1 is strongly disagreeing. Number 3 is a neutral point. Number 5 is strongly agreeing. And the items we asked researchers to rank were some of, so just to give you an illustration, to give you a feel, what could this epistemic tolerance be, how it's operationalized. So some of the items were, it is possible that researchers with whom I disagree are right. Even the work of authors with whose views I disagree have scientific value, and so on. When it comes to epistemic authoritarianism, the scale was very similarly constructed, but it was a 5-point Likert type scale, but the items were testing epistemic authoritarianism, and here are some examples. The academic authorities in my field are right. The questions within my scientific field can be fully explained by widely accepted theories in the field. Skepticism towards the scientific method was a longer, more comprehensive scale, and we were interested in several components that could trigger skepticism in science. The inspiration for this comes from philosophy of science. One of the aspects that we were interested in is whether researchers are concerned with subjectivity of scientific research, and an illustrating item is scientists cannot avoid the influence of their preconceptions. Then we wondered the skepticism about whether science really describes objective truth. So an item illustrating this component, not even mathematics can reveal the objective truth. And then we also wondered how much they question the scientific process, how random it is. So the progress in science happens by random. I must immediately tell you, researchers were not impressed with this scale, so they ranked rather low on skepticism towards the scientific method, meaning that these philosophical questions are not of their high interest. The instruments for other attitudes that we measured were the established ones, so the ones that already exist in literature that have been tested and explored previously. What might be interesting for a philosophical audience, that's that when we asked them about theory of evolution, the already existing scale has a component that's influenced by Popper's falsification method, which says evolution is not a scientific theory because it cannot be falsified. And I also singled out for you one item where researchers scored highest on the astrology scale. They did not believe in astrology. However, this item apparently is most convincing to them. Astrology can be useful for predicting one's personality traits, I guess because it is not a very strong claim. However, we still don't want them to believe in this. Social and economic conservatism was tested using feelings thermometer. That's an existing method where participants are asked to rank how strong, so to say how strong they feel about a certain concept on a feeling thermometer from 0 to 100. So they should rank each of these, so they should evaluate each of these notions separately, of course. And some of the notions were tradition, abortion, business, and so on. The sample was, as previously mentioned, large. It was well balanced when it comes to distribution between natural and social sciences. We had more junior researchers, but still a significant number of senior researchers as our participants. And we had slightly more females than males. The results show very promising tendencies. That is that researchers are highly epistemically tolerant. So their average response was 4.4 for the claims about epistemic tolerance, and you remember the maximum is 5. They also scored low on epistemicauthoritarianism scale and even lower on the skepticism towards the scientific method. When it comes to these assumptions and the effect of the scientific field, social scientists were more epistemically tolerant than natural scientists, which is to be expected. But again, all these effects are rather small because they all are very epistemically tolerant. The effect of the seniority was also present, but partially. So the interesting group were researchers, junior researchers in social sciences, because they were the ones who questioned the scientific method most. However, over the time, it seems that researchers start believing in their methods more and more. In natural sciences, this effect did not exist. The summary of the main results is that there is a correlation between epistemic authoritarianism and conservatism. There is a negative correlation between epistemic tolerance and conservatism. Both of these correlations are of a weak effect, which is very good for us. So they are not, we can still assume that someone can be a very good scientist and be very open when it comes to science, independent of any political perspective. The effect of the political orientation, of the social perspective, the effect of the political orientation was rather small, and the effect of political orientation skepticism towards the scientific method, both right-wing and left-wing, was not present. So that was not detected at all. We did notice the differences between junior and senior researchers, and the only thing I didn't tell you yet, that's that junior researchers in social sciences tend to question the theory of evolution more than everybody else, but this changes over time, which might indicate that some of these epistemic attitudes can be learned. As conclusions, our instruments for measuring epistemic attitudes performed well and hopefully will be used again in the future. We have reasons for optimism as scientists highly value epistemic tolerance, and there are no significant effects between political views and epistemic stances. There is a difference in epistemic tolerance between fields of research, but this difference is also not large and it's easy to explain. Junior researchers in social sciences tend to doubt the scientific method more. What will be our future work will be to see whether there is an interplay between epistemic attitudes and socio-political attitudes of people from lay people, so people in general population. So we wonder whether scientists are some exception or this is a general tendency. Then we also wonder whether there is a cultural effect when it comes to the epistemic attitudes. So it's possible in some cultures, epistemic collective efforts are valued more. One should notice that our survey was done in the context of Serbia, and it's not clear whether in other national contexts these results would be identical. Finally, I will leave you with a thought: why should we care about all this research? That's because collective efforts are what drives our knowledge acquisition forward. Thank you so much.